Hello, in this video we're going to go into the meaning of the word mental picture as it's used in the philosophy of freedom. The word mental picture is translated loosely from the German word Vorstellung. And so understanding the word Vorstellung and how it's used in German is going to greatly help us in understanding what the word mental picture means. First of all, what's the official translation of the word Vorstellung? It's a noun, and in philosophy it means a mental image or idea produced by prior perception of an object, as in a memory or imagination, rather than by actual perception. So we can quite correctly translate Vorstellung as idea. However, as you will see, the word idea in English has got quite a broad meaning. On the screen here we've got two sentences. The first one is, I have an idea. I'm going to jump out of an aeroplane with a parachute on my back and I'm going to land and I'm going to be safe and fine and it's all going to work. The second sentence is, I have no idea what it's like to jump out of an aeroplane. I've never done it before. I've just used the word idea in both these sentences. However, in the second sentence, I can swap the word idea with the word imagine and not change the meaning of the sentence. So I can say, I cannot imagine what it will be like to jump out an aeroplane. I've never done it before. But I cannot swap the word idea in the first sentence with the word imagine and not change the meaning of the sentence. Because the first sentence is not referring to some imagined experience. The first sentence is referring to a concept of the activity itself. So here we can see that in English we use the word idea quite liberally for two quite different meanings. In German there are two different words for these two different meanings. And the word used in German for the first sentence would be Idee. So one would say, Ich habe eine Idee. In the second sentence, because it's more to do with an imagined experience or a mental picture of an experience, one would say, Ich kann mir nicht vorstellen, wie es ist. I cannot imagine what it is like to jump out of an aeroplane. In the German, one would not use the word Idee in the second sentence. You wouldn't say, Ich habe keine Idee, wie es ist to jump out of an aeroplane. So this is the distinction in German between Vorstellung and Idee, and why it is problematic to translate Vorstellung into the English word idea. Because in English we use the word idea in two different spheres of meaning. One sphere is more conceptual, that's the first sentence, it's more conceptual. I have a conceptual idea of how to jump out of an aeroplane and not die. Whereas in the second one, I'm referring to whether I can imagine what it's like despite never having experienced it. So in the second sentence, I'm trying to imagine a reality which I have never experienced. And this is why Schopenhauer says, the world is my Vorstellung, because he's talking about the world as being something which is experienced only in his consciousness. The reality he has never experienced. He's saying we never experience reality as it is, we only experience our own Vorstellung of reality. That is our own mental picture of reality.
The perceived world is my mental representation. I know of no sun and of no earth, but only of an eye that sees a sun and hand that feels an earth. The world which surrounds me exists only as a mental representation. Steiner has something to say about this point of view. He says, hang on, this whole theory is wrecked by the fact that the eye and hand are themselves perceptions just as much as the sun and the earth. Using Schopenhauer's expression, we could reply, my eye that sees the sun and my hand that feels the earth are my mental representations just as much as the sun and the earth themselves. that the whole theory then cancels itself out is clear without further argument. So there's some key words in this exchange. Uh, the main one being the word mental representation, which is the English translation of the German word Vorstellung. The philosophy of freedom translates the word Vorstellung as mental picture. But I want to bring Owen Barfield into the mix at this point because he is going to be very helpful with this whole discussion between Schopenhauer and Steiner, or the problem. And he's also going to be helpful with the word mental representation or Vorstellung. And because Owen Barfield talks about representations, collective representations, I think it's helpful, it's just simpler and more convenient to translate Vorstellung as a mental representation. Because in essence, what Schopenhauer is saying is that the world around us, and this is where we bring in Owen Barfield, the representations that I perceive are representations within my mind. I know only the representations of a world in my mind. I don't know the world in itself. This is Schopenhauer's point of view. I only know that I experience, so in Schopenhauer's analogy, I am only aware that my eye sees a sun and my hand feels an earth. And now, of course, Steiner points out that there's an inconsistency here because if one remains with the argument that the sun and the earth are just representations and not realities in their own right, then one has to also maintain that one's hand and one's eye are themselves mere representations, and that a representation cannot affect another representation. Only the real sun can affect the real eye, and the real hand touch the real earth. So the challenge that both Barfield and Steiner seem to be setting us is to save the representations, save the appearances from two fronts, from two sides. They're being attacked by two sides. One side is our naive realism, which is assuming that the trees and the animals and the earth and the sun and the planets all exist in a sort of a naive realistic way, independent of our perception. And thus we turn them into idols because we're assuming that they are ultimates. We're assuming that they exist in the same way that we assume the particles exist. So the one challenge is to save them from this idolatry. From the other side, the representations are attacked from the Kantian perspective, which is characterized by Schopenhauer in our example, which states that the appearances, that the trees and the animals and the sun, that the world we perceive is simply a representation in our own minds and has no objective validity independent of our consciousness. In its extreme form, it's solipsism. And this is why the criticism that was leveled against Steiner by a contemporary philosopher of his, Edward von Hartmann, the criticism was that he had reverted into naive realism. Von Hartmann couldn't conceive in what manner Steiner was describing the appearances to exist. He couldn't conceive of the relationship between thinking and the appearances. Von Hartmann couldn't imagine that his own thinking activity could be anything other than something just happening in his own head. He certainly wasn't going to conceive of thinking itself as being the objective underlying principle of existence. So at any rate, I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching.